The conference room on the 22nd floor read 47 minutes on the countdown clock, $17 million of client data, 47 minutes from a full automatic wipe. Derek Finch had just finished telling the room the man responsible was standing at the far end of the table, Marcus Hale, Temp IT. Support, orange badge letters, wrinkled collar, hands loose at his sides. Claire Ashton, COO, 33 years old and fewer than 90 days in the role, looked at him and said quietly, "You have 5 minutes to show me you didn't do this. Go." Marcus did not say a word in his defense. He opened his laptop. 3 years before that morning, Marcus Hale had driven into Chicago in November with 2 duffel bags in the trunk and his son Theo buckled into the back seat, asleep before they crossed the Wisconsin state line. Theo was 7 then, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and a habit of pressing his lips together when he concentrated that made him look, in certain light, startlingly like Rachel. Rachel had been gone for 11 months by the time they made that drive. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 at diagnosis, stage 4 8 weeks after that. She had insisted on the clinical trials, had researched them herself, printed the studies, asked the questions Marcus had not known to ask, and approached the whole terrible business with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything in her life. The trials had cost more than 2 years of his salary, and they had not worked. And when it was over, he was left with a stack of medical bills, a son learning to read slower than his classmates, and a resume with one significant and irresolvable problem. He was good at what he did. He was, by the estimation of anyone who had ever watched him work, exceptionally good. He had taught himself systems architecture from library books and online documentation and years of trial and error on second-hand machines he bought at auction and disassembled on the kitchen table at night after Theo was in bed. He had no formal credential. What he had instead was the ability to look at a system the way a musician looks at a piece of music, not just the notes, but the logic underneath the notes, the reason the whole thing holds together or falls apart. He had built the back-end infrastructure for a startup called Meridian Tech from a collection of mismatched legacy tools into something clean and scalable and fast, and the company had grown 40% in 18 months on the strength of what he built. He had been good at his job, and proud of being good at it, and had believed, with the specific naivete of someone who has earned confidence through labor, that being genuinely good at something was its own kind of credential. Then a routine HR compliance audit had flagged his file. The offer letter had listed a bachelor's degree as a requirement. The HR department processed the termination in 48 hours, using language that was professionally sympathetic and entirely without room for appeal. He had packed his desk into a paper grocery bag, thanked the receptionist by name on his way out, and gone home to make chicken soup because Theo had a cold and the apartment needed to smell like something warm. The job at Caldwell Group was the 9th position he had taken in 2 years. IT support, temporary contract, 90 days with the possibility of extension. Sandra Yee, who ran the IT department, had interviewed him on the 14th floor and not asked once about his education. She slid a server diagnostic report across the table and said, "Tell me what's wrong with this." He identified 6 issues in under 4 minutes, prioritized by severity, remediation path for each. She hired him before he reached the elevator. On his 3rd day, a legacy storage server 2 senior engineers had declared unrecoverable was back online within 2 hours and 17 minutes of Marcus sitting down in front of it. Sandra read his incident report afterward and circled one line in pencil without comment, which Marcus had come to understand was her highest form of acknowledgement. The first time Claire Ashton noticed him had nothing to do with a server. It was a Tuesday in mid-October. She was walking back from a quarterly review she had not wanted to attend, taking the route past the east side windows because on clear days you could see the lake, and she had developed a habit of finding it when she needed a moment of something that was not a question she was expected to answer. Marcus was sitting on a bench outside the break room, eating a sandwich, phone to his ear. She would have kept walking if she had not caught, in her peripheral vision, the stillness of someone receiving unexpected good news. A child's voice came through the phone, small and bright, and clearly excited. "Dad, I read the whole paragraph. By myself, the whole thing." Marcus smiled. Not the managed smile of a man performing contentment in a professional setting, but a real one, arriving before his face had time to arrange itself. Claire's father had been dead for 14 days. She had not smiled like that in longer than she wanted to count. She walked past without slowing. She did not entirely forget what she had seen. The breach happened on a Wednesday. Late. At 11:47 p.m., the CRM system containing the personal and financial records of more than 340,000 clients went dark. The ransomware was sophisticated, not the crude, self-announcing variety, but the kind assembled by someone who understood how enterprise systems breathe, which logs to corrupt first, which secondary backups to eliminate before the primary failsafe could invoke them. An automated self-termination sequence built into the system architecture during a compliance overhaul 4 years earlier would activate once data integrity thresholds fell below a set level. The attack had been specifically designed to push those thresholds past the point of no return. By the time the first monitoring alert fired, the countdown had already been running for 11 minutes. Derek Finch called the emergency meeting for 6 a.m. He arrived before anyone else and spent the interval arranging his presentation with the unhurried precision of someone who has rehearsed the sequence of events he intends to narrate. By the time the other executives filed in terse, compressed, moving with the urgent efficiency of people who received very bad news before their first coffee, Derek was standing at the head of the table with his presentation already loaded, and his posture carrying the specific confidence of someone who has decided in advance how the story is going to end. He did not waste time. The internal access log, he explained, showed an unambiguous chain of access. The last authenticated user to enter the core production environment before the breach was Marcus Hale at 11:31 p.m. He advanced each slide with measured confidence. He used the phrase, "established chain of access," 3 separate times. He did not offer any explanation for why a temporary IT support contractor would possess credentials permitting access to the core production environment in the middle of the night, because the executives filling the room had not yet thought to ask. The narrative he was presenting made the question feel redundant. The countdown clock, still showing above 40 minutes on the wall screen, was doing considerable persuasive work on its own. Marcus sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. 2 weeks earlier, Sandra had extended his system access so he could run a late-night maintenance script when both assigned senior engineers called in sick on the same night. He had run the script, filed a complete incident report, logged out, and gone home at 11:30 p.m., which was, he now noted in the silence of the meeting, 11 minutes before the timestamp Derek had presented as evidence. That access had not been revoked when the task was complete, a procedural gap nobody had flagged, and which now sat in the room like something with actual mass, pressing quietly against the story Derek was telling. He had no alibi, in the conventional sense. He had been asleep. He always turned his phone off after Theo went down for the night. Had done so since Theo was 3, because the hours after his son was asleep were the hours Marcus had decided belonged to something other than work and urgency and the world's continuous demands for his attention. He had no witness and no digital receipt. What he had was the truth, and in that room at that moment the truth had no visible surface to stand on. When Derek finished and formally recommended immediate suspension pending handover to law enforcement, the room began moving toward agreement, the way a crowd moves not through any single decision, but through the quiet accumulation of momentum. Claire had been watching Marcus throughout the entire presentation, not with accusation, not with sympathy, but with the specific, unhurried quality of attention she brought to problems she had not yet finished understanding. She said, when the consensus had nearly completed itself, "Do you want to say anything?" Marcus looked at her directly. He said, "I want to see the raw log file." Derek said, "That's no longer your concern." The pause that followed lasted 4 seconds and had the texture of something being decided quietly, below the level of words. Claire said, "Give him read, only access to the server logs, and 5 minutes. Now." Sandra exhaled very quietly near the back of the room. Derek began to object. Claire turned her head toward him with an expression that completed the sentence without words. He stopped. Someone across the table pulled up the access panel and extended read-only credentials to Marcus's workstation. The countdown clock read 38 minutes and 20 seconds. Every person in the room was watching Marcus. The weight of what was at stake, the data, the clients, the company's exposure. The clock pressed down on the space between his chair and the laptop in front of him like something physical. Marcus did not acknowledge the weight. He worked the way he always worked, without excess motion, without performance, with the concentrated efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and trusts the process of looking for it. He opened the server log index and navigated to the timestamp cluster surrounding 11:30 p.m. He did not look at the entry bearing his name. He looked at the metadata, the file modification records, the right timestamps, the system-level audit trail that existed beneath the surface layer that standard security reviews were built to examine. 90 seconds in, he found the first irregularity. 2 minutes and 40 seconds in, he understood exactly what he was looking at. The timestamp attached to his access record had been edited, not deleted, not overwritten in a way that left an obvious absence, edited with a precision that would have cleared a standard audit review without triggering any automated flag. What the edit had not accounted for was the shadow copy layer. A redundant timestamp record written automatically to a separate system partition every time any file in the primary log directory was modified. The shadow layer was not part of the standard audit interface. It was not visible through the dashboard most administrators used and most security reviewers examined. Marcus had read about it in a technical white paper 3 years earlier, during the long stretch between jobs when he read anything he could find to stay current, and he had retained it the way he retained things that struck him as quietly important, without knowing when or whether the knowledge would become useful. He ran a single command. The output populated his screen in 2 columns. The shadow timestamp on his access record showed the file had been modified at 12:14 a.m. 43 minutes after the breach began. The original entry, preserved unaltered in the shadow layer, showed 11:17 p.m., consistent with the maintenance window Sandra had authorized. 11 minutes of logged activity, a complete incident report, a logout sequence at 11:28. The real breach timestamp, also in the shadow layer, pointed to a different device entirely. An IP address registered in the company's internal asset management system under a single device name, D. Finch, Personal, 02. He typed one final command. The VPN session log for that device appeared on his screen. It showed an active connection established at 11:44 p.m. The breach had begun 3 minutes later, at 11:47. Marcus turned the laptop around so that the screen faced Claire and placed both hands flat on the table and waited. The countdown clock read 34 minutes and 50 seconds. Claire stood up. She walked to his end of the table, stood before the screen, and read through the output without speaking. The room held completely still. 3 executives across the table exchanged glances that carried no words, only the beginning of a revised understanding. Claire looked at the data for a long moment. Then she looked at Derek. Derek said, "This is a system anomaly. The shadow layer produces inconsistent readings under high server load. This does not establish," Claire said. "Derek, sit down." She said it without raising her voice. She did not need to. The third-party security firm arrived before noon. Their lead forensic analyst had spent 12 years doing data recovery work for financial institutions and had the particular economy of motion that comes from having seen most things go wrong in most possible ways. She reviewed Marcus's methodology in 5 minutes, asked him to walk her through it step by step from the beginning, listened without interrupting, and then handed him a secondary terminal and said, "Stay." Over the next 4 hours, the investigation moved through layers that were progressively harder to look at with any clarity. Derek Finch had not been acting as a proxy for an external threat actor. He had built and deployed the ransomware himself against his own company's infrastructure, targeting not the client data broadly, but one specific encrypted archive stored in a legacy partition that had not been included in the primary system migration 3 years earlier. The archive contained internal contracts, 6 years of them, going back through the full period of Robert Ashton's active leadership. Robert Ashton, Claire's father, had built Caldwell Group from a small regional consultancy into a respected Midwest financial services firm over 22 years before dying of a sudden cardiac event 8 months ago. The contracts documented a series of software vendor agreements, all channeled through a single provider, all priced at approximately double the prevailing market rate for comparable services. Each contract carried Robert Ashton's signature on the primary approval line. Each also carried, in an advisory capacity that was technically non-binding and practically decisive, the initials D.F. The commission structure written into each agreement, routed through a Delaware-registered LLC with no apparent connection to Caldwell Group, had delivered just over $4 million to Derek Finch across 6 years. The ransomware had not been designed to hold data for ransom. It had been designed to generate enough systemic chaos to justify an emergency full server wipe, which would have taken the contracts with it and left only the surface of the story Derek had intended to tell. When the recovery sequence completed, and the archived files began appearing on the analyst's workstation screen, Marcus stood up. He had been in the room for nearly 5 hours. He had not eaten anything since a granola bar before 6 in the morning, and Theo's school pickup was at 3:15. He picked his jacket up from the back of his chair and started toward the door. He was not thinking about what the morning had meant for his position or his contract or any version of his future at the company. The investigation had moved into the hands of people whose job it was. The legal team was already on a call, and the forensic analyst was generating reports with the practiced rhythm of someone who would be here long after he left. None of it required him anymore. He was thinking about whether there was enough pasta at home. Claire said his name. He stopped and turned around. She said, "Thank you." She did not add anything to it, did not append an explanation or qualification. She did not describe what she meant, which had very little to do with the log file and a great deal to do with what the company, the clients, and she personally would have been facing if he had spent those 5 minutes defending himself instead of working. Marcus looked at her for one moment, the particular, level quality of his attention that she had come to recognize as the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. Then he nodded once, put on his jacket, and left. Derek Finch was suspended before the end of the business day. The news spread across the 22nd floor, the way significant news spreads in contained spaces quickly, incompletely, with the restless energy of a group that senses the full shape of something but cannot yet see all of it. Marcus was not there for any of it. He was in the school pickup line by 3:10, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, watching Theo come through the double doors, with a library book under one arm, and the slightly distracted expression of someone whose thoughts are still partly inside a story. Theo saw him and ran the last 20 feet. Marcus caught him and held on 3 seconds longer than usual. Theo did not comment on this. He made spaghetti that night. Theo chose the movie Something Animated and Loud that Marcus had seen 4 times, and Marcus fell asleep on the couch before the second act. Theo turned off the television at some point and laid a blanket over him, because Theo was 9 and more competent in the quiet, practical dimensions of care than most adults gave him credit for. In the hour before sleep fully arrived, Marcus lay in the dark and thought about Rachel. He thought about a conversation they had had in the hospital during the second round of treatment, when she had held both of his hands in hers and told him, in that direct and unhurried way she had, that she needed him to promise he would not spend what remained of his life waiting for things to become what they had been. That he would let what came next be its own thing and approach it without apology. He had promised. He was not always certain he was keeping it. 4 miles north, Claire was still at her desk at 9 in the evening. She had been there since the security firm left, working through the compliance documentation the investigation had generated, reading things that required careful attention and gave very little back in the way of comfort. At some point, she stopped and pulled Marcus's personnel file from the cabinet beside her father's desk, a cabinet she had not yet moved, had not yet permitted herself to move. She opened the file for the first time with genuine, careful attention. 9 positions in 26 months. References from 4 cities, 1 dependent listed, no degree of any kind. At the back of the file, clipped to the last page, was a yellow adhesive note in Sandra Yee's handwriting. "This one sees things other people don't." Claire read it once. She turned it over, as though looking for the verso of the sentence, and found only the blank back of the paper. She sat quietly in the empty office for a long moment, in the particular silence of a room where someone is making a decision they did not expect to be making at this hour, about a person they did not expect to be thinking about in this way. There were procedurally correct things to do, and there were the right things to do, and she had spent 9 years in a company where her father had, most of the time and with imperfect success, tried to make those two categories overlap. Then she opened the file again and began writing on a notepad. She wrote for 12 minutes. She crossed out the first 2 lines. She kept the rest. Marcus arrived the following morning at 8 o'clock, which was his habit. He was carrying coffee he had made at home in a travel mug, because the corner shop charged $4, and he had decided years ago that $4 was money with better uses. His temporary contract expired on Friday. He had not been contacted with any indication otherwise, and 9 jobs had taught him that the absence of a conversation about continuation was itself a kind of answer. He was composing a mental checklist of end-of-contract tasks: return the equipment, clear personal files from the server, write an accurate and generously worded entry for his resume, when Sandra appeared in the lobby with an expression he had never quite seen from her before. Not sympathy. Something considerably more energized than that. She told him to go upstairs. The conference room was quieter in the morning light. The countdown clock was gone from the wall screen. The chairs were pushed back into their places. Claire was standing near the window when he came in, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was not uncomfortable in the way silence can sometimes be. She crossed to the table and set an envelope down in front of an empty chair, and waited. Marcus sat and looked at the envelope without picking it up. It contained a formal employment offer. Senior Systems Architect. A base salary that was, as best he could calculate on the spot, approximately 3 times his current daily rate extended across a full year, comprehensive benefits, and a clause he had never seen in any offer letter before. A skills verification pathway, formally structured and legally binding, that substituted documented project outcomes and a rigorous technical panel assessment for the standard educational credential requirement. The degree barrier had not been waived or overlooked. It had been replaced with something that acknowledged, in the language of a signed document, that there was more than one legitimate way to demonstrate what a person knows. He did not pick up the envelope. He said, "Why?" Claire said, "Because the best person in this building yesterday didn't have a permanent badge." He looked at the table. He was thinking about something she could not have known: the discipline he had developed over years of being offered things and then having them removed on procedural grounds, a discipline that expressed itself as a careful management of wanting, a habit of holding good news at a distance until it had proven it was going to stay. He said, "I need to ask my son." The sentence landed in the room with a weight that had nothing to do with the decision it was deferring, and everything to do with what it said about how he made decisions, and who he had built his life around, and what it meant that this was where the answer lived. Claire looked at him. Something in her expression changed very slightly, in a way that was not easy to name precisely, but was visible to anyone paying the kind of attention she had been paying to Marcus Hale for the past 2 days. She said, "Take whatever time you need," and then she smiled, small, unguarded, arriving without any of the management that usually preceded it, and she looked, in that moment, like someone who had come a little closer to herself than she had been permitting since the day of her father's funeral. On Saturday, Marcus took Theo to Lincoln Park. They walked the path along the South Pond, and Theo threw pieces of a stale roll at the ducks with the focused intensity he brought to most activities, and Marcus told him about the week, without quite making it a story centered on himself. He said he had helped fix something important at work. He said the company had offered him a real job, a permanent one. Theo processed this in silence for about 30 seconds, then said, "Do you like her?" Marcus said, "What?" Theo said, "The lady at your work. Do you like her?" Marcus did not answer. Theo nodded once as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, and turned his attention back to the ducks. For a 9-year-old with Theo's particular gift for observation, the silence had been fully adequate as a response. What Marcus did not know, sitting on that bench while his son negotiated with waterfowl, was that 60 blocks north Claire Ashton was at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, reading a document that had arrived from the company's legal team the previous evening. It was an internal compliance report generated as a byproduct of the forensic audit of Derek's activities, and buried in its appendix were forwarded emails exchanged through private accounts between Derek Finch and Garrett Hollis, who had served on Caldwell Group's board of directors for 11 years. The emails spanned nearly 3 years. They documented Hollis's awareness of the vendor commission arrangement and his active participation in suppressing 2 internal compliance reviews that had come within a few pointed questions of surfacing it. The final email had been sent 6 weeks earlier and concerned neither the contracts nor Derek's arrangement. It concerned Claire. Hollis had written that the board had an obligation to assess whether the COO transition had been appropriately managed, and that he had been in contact with institutional investors who shared reservations about whether current leadership had the depth of experience the company's current circumstances required. He had a candidate in mind. He would begin the appropriate conversations at his discretion. Claire read the email twice. Then a third time. The way she read things when she needed to understand not just the words, but the intention beneath them. The intention was not difficult to find. Hollis had been on the board when her father hired her, had watched her work through every department in the company over 9 years, had shaken her hand at Robert Ashton's funeral, and told her he believed in the continuity she represented. He had been preparing this while he shook her hand. She was not naive enough to be surprised. She had understood, from the first week in this role, that the position her father had left her was not simply a title but a contested thing, contested by people who had expected to move into the space his absence created, and had found her in it instead. This was just the first time one of them had stopped being subtle about it. What she felt most clearly was not anger, but the particular clarity that arrives when a situation finally reveals exactly what it is, and you understand what you need to do. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. She did not explain everything. She said, "Have you ever had to fight for something that someone else decided didn't belong to you?" A brief pause. "Not a long one," he said. "Every day of my adult life." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "The offer still stands. Monday morning." He said, "I know. I've already decided." She said, "Good." She ended the call. The exchange had the quality of something complete, and she did not feel the need to add anything to it. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 a.m. Monday. Sandra texted Marcus at 7:45 with 3 words. "They're using you." Marcus read it twice, put his phone in his coat pocket, and drove to Caldwell Group. Garrett Hollis had prepared carefully. His materials were 16 pages, polished and tabbed, framing the breach and its handling as evidence of systemic leadership failure in the months since Claire had assumed the COO role. The decision to extend production system credentials to an underqualified temporary contractor was presented with specific references to company policy documents as a protocol violation that had directly enabled the attack. That this framing was demonstrably and documentably false was not something Hollis appeared to consider a significant obstacle. He had calculated, probably accurately, that the board's technical familiarity with the specific architecture involved was limited, and that institutional language and polished materials, in the absence of a counter-narrative, carried considerable persuasive weight. He had 3 members prepared to support a formal leadership review. With his own vote, that was 4. He needed 5. The meeting had been running for 22 minutes when the door at the far end of the room opened. No one had expected it. There had been no request to attend, no item on the agenda, no communication of any kind. The door had simply opened, and Marcus Hale had walked in, and the room had done what rooms do when something unexpected enters them. It had paused, recalibrated, and waited to see what happened next. Marcus walked to the end of the table and set down a spiral-bound document 41 pages, organized with the same quiet structural clarity he brought to every technical problem that he had assembled the previous night after putting Theo to bed. It contained a complete reconstruction of the breach event, from the first unauthorized VPN connection to the final data recovery. Timeline, attack methodology, the full evidence chain, shadow log analysis, detailed documentation of how Derek Finch had built and deployed the ransomware from inside the company's own network. The final section was a financial modeling comparison between two scenarios. In the first scenario, the breach response as it had actually occurred. With Claire Ashton's decision to give Marcus 5 minutes, the total documented cost to Caldwell Group was $1.2 million. In the second scenario, the breach response absent that decision, modeled conservatively against industry-standard projections for full data destruction, regulatory exposure, and client litigation, the projected total damage was $41 million. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when a document has landed on the table and the people around it have not yet finished deciding what it means for them. Garrett Hollis looked at Marcus and said, "Who are you, and on what basis are you present in this room?" Marcus said, "I'm the person whose 5 minutes saved this company $40 million. He sat down in the empty chair, folded his hands on the table, and waited. He did not elaborate. He did not look around the room to gauge the effect. He looked at the document in front of him, then at Claire, who was sitting across the table and had not taken her eyes off him since he walked through the door, not with surprise, with something quieter and more settled, the expression of someone who has stopped being astonished by a thing and begun simply to accept the shape of it. 2 board members had already opened their copies of his document. A third reached across the table and slid one toward himself without speaking. Hollis glanced at his presentation on the screen, then at the spiral-bound pages in front of the people he had needed to persuade. For the first time since the meeting began, his posture carried something other than certainty. The board deliberated behind closed doors for 20 minutes. The vote came back 5-2 in favor of retaining Claire Ashton as Chief Operating Officer. Hollis and 1 allied member cast the opposing votes. The result was announced without ceremony or elaboration. Hollis gathered his materials and left the room without speaking to anyone. Within 90 minutes, he had received formal written notification that the board's governance committee was initiating a conduct review regarding his communications with Derek Finch over the preceding 3 years, and that his full cooperation was expected. His attorney responded the following morning, which amounted to the same thing. Marcus signed his employment contract at 2 in the afternoon in a small HR office, using a pen the coordinator told him he could keep. He left it on her desk. Sandra was waiting in the hallway and applauded twice, softly, as though she did not want to startle the moment. Marcus shook his head and smiled the smile of someone not yet entirely sure the thing in front of him is as durable as it appears. It was not a small smile. It was just a careful one. Claire did not mark the day with any kind of celebration. She went to her father's office, which was still her father's office in every way that mattered: his books, arranged on the shelves in exactly the order he had placed them, his framed credentials on the wall, the photograph of the 2 of them at her graduation that she had not moved because moving it would have required deciding something about permanence she was not yet ready to decide. She sat in his chair. The afternoon light came through the blinds in long horizontal lines across the surface of the desk. She sat with the question of whether he had known about the contracts, whether Derek had been careful enough to keep them from a man who held strong and specific views about integrity, or whether her father had looked at something he did not want to fully see and made the quiet, human choice not to look further. She had been turning this question over since the contracts first appeared on the forensic analyst's screen, and she had not arrived at an answer that felt settled, and she had come to accept, in the past few hours, that she probably never would. She thought it was possible to love someone completely, and to acknowledge what you could not account for in them, and to hold both of those facts at the same time, without resolving the tension between them. She thought that requiring resolution was the wrong instinct, that the tension itself was part of what it meant to actually know a person rather than just the idea of them. She thought this was not the same as losing the person. She thought it was something closer to the truth of what loving someone actually requires. She was still sitting with this when the knock came. She had just enough time to wipe her face before saying, "Come in." Marcus came through the door. He looked at her and did not pretend not to see. He crossed the office without hurrying and placed a cup of coffee on the corner of the desk. She looked at it. No sugar, oat milk, the specific ratio she had mentioned, without thinking during a phone call on Sunday morning. She looked up at him. He said, "Long day." She said, "For both of us." The afternoon light moved another inch across the surface of the desk, and neither of them spoke again for a moment, and the moment had the quality of something that does not require words to be fully inhabited. 3 months after that afternoon, Marcus Hale stood at the front of the 22nd floor conference room and walked Caldwell Group's full leadership team through the company's new security architecture. His badge said Senior Systems Architect in white letters. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes, not because the material was simple, but because he had learned it until it was part of how he thought, and he wanted the people in the room to feel the difference between someone reciting information and someone who had understood it well enough to explain it plainly. Theo was in the hallway. A school holiday, a scheduling conflict, Sandra's offer to sit with him during the presentation, and then Sandra getting pulled into something else. Theo sat on a bench with a library book open across his knees and read at the pace that was his pace, which had improved considerably over 3 months and which still moved, by certain measures, with deliberation. His father had told him once that reading slowly meant you stayed inside the story longer. Theo had examined this idea carefully and decided it was true. Claire came down the hallway at 11:40 on her way back from a call with the compliance auditors. She saw the boy on the bench before she placed who he was. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and the quietly concentrated expression of someone working through something without making a production of the effort. She slowed. She stopped. She sat down beside him on the bench, leaving appropriate distance, and looked at the open page without reading it. She said, "What are you working on?" He said, "Reading." He looked up. He recognized her from a photograph on his father's phone, which Marcus did not know he had seen. He said, "You're Claire." She said, "That's right. You must be Theo." He nodded. He said, "Dad talks about work more than he used to. He didn't really before." She said, "Is that a good thing?" He thought about it the way he thought about most things without hurrying, with genuine respect for the question. He said, "Yeah, I think it is." They talked for 12 minutes. About the book, which featured a dog crossing a mountain range in winter and making choices the narrative treated with considerable moral seriousness. About whether reading slowly was a disadvantage or just a different kind of pace, on which Theo had specific and considered views. At one point he asked what her job was, and she told him she ran a company, and he said, "Is it hard?" She said, "Some days." He said, "Dad says the hard days are the ones that matter." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "He's right about that." When Marcus came out of the conference room and saw them, he stopped in the doorway. They had not heard the door. Claire was saying something about the dog in Theo's book, and Theo was listening with the full, unhurried quality of attention he brought to things he genuinely wanted to understand. The winter light came through the hallway windows in a way that made everything look clear and close. Marcus stood there with his laptop under his arm and his badge clipped to his lapel and watched the two of them. He did not move. He did not announce himself. He did not try to name what he was looking at, because some things do not need a name in order to be real. There was no declaration, no single sentence that defined what had accumulated between two people over 3 months of a shared building, a shared crisis, a phone call on a Sunday morning, and a cup of coffee placed on a desk without explanation. There was a hallway and 3 people standing in it, and the quiet, ordinary beginning of something that none of them had planned, and all of them, in their different ways, had become ready for without quite noticing the moment it arrived. Marcus Hale had been given 5 minutes to prove himself. He had used 4.5. The remaining 30 seconds he had kept, the way he kept most things that were truly his without announcement, without asking whether he had the right. He had learned long before that morning in the conference room that not everything worth having requires you to make a case for it. Some things, if you are patient and you do not flinch, will make the case themselves.